Good day to our lecturer. We are from tutorial 11 group D and today our group will be presenting our video project for contract law 2 under the module code UNL 6123. In this presentation, we will be diving into a complex construction law dispute, analyzing the intricate contractual dynamics, legal variation and supervening events that brought the agreement to a halt. Our team consists of 5 members, myself Yakeshwaran Kanyan, followed by Kendrick Brito, Vinay Sharma Analaki Sivam, Mathura Ravi Shankar, and finally Kavinraj Manikam Sivanathan. Together we will dissect the facts and legal issues and applicable remedies of this case. Let us first look at how the dispute arose. In January 2024, Amerlin Development contracted Alman Build to construct a commercial complex for RM 12 million with a restrict completion deadline of December 31st, 2024. The written agreement was highly robust, explicitly specifying certified stage payments. A time is of the essence clause. Amerlin writes to terminate the contract for a lack of diligence and force majeure clause covering acts of God and government intervention. By August 2024, the project's progress was steady, with Aman having completed roughly 75% of the construction work and receiving RM 9 million in payments, leaving an outstanding original balance of RM 3 million. However, the dynamic shifted significantly in September 2024. Citing rising material costs, Aman requested to 3 months extension and an extra RM 1 million. Amerlin agreed in writing to extend the completion date to March 31st, 2025 and promised to provide an additional RM 500,000 conditional upon Aman maintaining reasonable progress through no formal supplementary agreement was ever executed. Unfortunately, between November 2024 and January 2025, Aman's progress slowed down drastically and eventually ceased entirely, with 25% of the project still left incomplete. When Amerlin issued a 14 days notice on January 15, 2025, demanding that work resume, Aman resisted the notice by citing financial inability and blaming Amerlin's refusal to grant a 1 million they had requested. The final blow to the project came in February 2025 when severe flooding destroyed substantial portion of the partially completed structure. This environmental disaster led the local authority to issue a mandatory 2 year construction prohibition pending a safety and environmental review. Consequently, seeing the project completely paralyzed, Amerlin terminated the contract on February 10, 2025, claiming damages for replacement contractor costs, delay losses, and lost anticipated rental income. Aman counter argues that the ARC contract was legally discharged by frustration due to the floods and subsequent government order, and they are now claiming payment for the construction work that successfully completed prior of these supervening events. In the remainder of our video presentation, we will apply established contract law principle and determine the liabilities and legal outcome for both parties. The primary purpose of this project is to critically analyze the contractual dispute between Amerlin Development Sdn Bhd and Aman Build Sdn Bhd under the framework of Malaysian Contracts Act 1950. Our analysis focuses on 4 legal areas. First, the validity of subsequent contractual variation. Second, whether a reparatory breach occurred. Third, the applicability of the doctrine of frustration alongside the contract force majeure clause. And lastly, the legal remedies available for both parties following the collapse of the construction project.
Thank you. My name is Kavin, and I'll be presenting the issue 2, which is whether the informal agreement made in September 2024, where Emerald agreed to extend the completion date to 31st March 2025 and pay an additional RM 500,000, constitutes the legally binding variation of the contract. To determine this issue, we must examine the relevant statutory provisions and case laws. Firstly, Section 63 of the Contracts Act 1950 provides the parties may substitute, resign, or alter an existing contract once a valid alteration is made. The original contract is no longer needed to perform according to its original terms. According to Section 64 of the Contracts Act 1950, it allows the promisee to dispense with a remit performance either wholly or partially, or extend the time of performance of a contractual obligations. The leading authorities on this issue would be in the case of Kapung Prospecting Limited against AE Skimt. In this case, the Skimt was an employee by the company when was promised remuneration based on the mining profits. Later on, there was a variation on the contractual agreements. Therefore, the dispute arose over whether the modification was enforceable despite the absence of the fresh consideration. The Privy Council held that under Section 63 and 64, the Contracts Act 1950, fresh consideration is not required for a valid contractual variation in Malaysia. The principle established that the Malaysian law differs from the English common law because statutory provisions allows the parties to vary contractual obligations without providing a new consideration. Another relevant case would be in the case of Syarikat Bahan Bahan Binaan UCP Sdn Berhad versus Peters Holding Sdn Berhad 1990. In this case, the parties negotiated and agreed on contractual terms through the correspondence, but a formal contract had not been executed. The court held that there was a clear evidence of a mutual agreement. The absence of the formal written contract does not prevent the agreement from becoming legally binding unless the parties expressly state the arrangement is subject to contract. The principle established that a consensus an item or a meeting of minds is sufficient to create a binding agreement even without a formal document. The final case would be the case of Central London Property Trust at Trees House, where in this case commonly known as the High Street case, where during World War II, the landlord agreed to accept the reduce the rent because occupancy rates has fallen significantly. After the war ended, the occupancy returned to normal. The landlord sought to claim the full rent. However, the court held that the party who makes a promise intended to be relied upon to be prevented from going back the promise while the circumstances justifying the promise to be continued to exist. The principle from this case that concession or waiver may be conditional as the condition is not no longer satisfied the party guaranteeing and the concession may resume to the original contractual rights. Applying to the law to the facts, Aman will argue that due to rising of material costs, they requested an extension of time and additional RM 500,000. Emerald expressly agreed in writing to both requests. Based on the Section 64 and the decision in a couple prospecting, Aman can argue that the variation was legally valid even though there was no fresh consideration was provided. Aman can further rely on the Sharikat Bahan Bahan Binan UCP's case to argue that the written correspondence for itself demonstrates the mutual consent and therefore a formal supplementary agreement was unnecessary. As a result, the original completion date of 31st December 2024 was effectively replaced by the new deadline 31st March 2025. However, Emerald also can argue that the variation was conditional rather than being absolute, where the written agreement clearly states that the extension and additional payment were guaranteed when only provided Armand continued to maintain reasonable progress on the project. Applying to the principle from the high trees, a conditional concession may be revoked when the condition was attached to its breached. Here, Aman allowed the construction progress to slow significantly and eventually cease between November 24 and January 2025. Therefore, Aman failed to satisfy the condition upon which was the concession was guaranteed. Consequently, Emerald can argue that it was legally entitled to withdraw the extension and enforce the original contractual obligations and deadlines. In conclusion, the September 2024 arrangement constituted a valid contractual variation under the Section 64 of the Contracts Act 1950. Based on the Kapong Prospecting and Sharikat Bahan Bahan Bin and UCP, neither fresh consideration nor a formal supplementary agreement was necessary. However, because of the variation was conditional upon Aman maintaining a reasonable progress and Aman failed to fulfill the condition, the principle in High Court trees allows the Emerald to revoke the concession and enforce the original contractual terms. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Good day, madam. My name is Kendrick, and I'll be presenting for issue 2. The issue is whether Aman's complete shutdown of construction work between November 2024 and January 2025 constitute a fundamental repudiatory breach under Section 40 of the Contract Act 1950. Okay, now let's look into the law. Section 40 of the Contract Act 1950. In simple terms, Section 40 states that if a party refuses to perform their promise in its entirety, the innocent party has a choice. They can either terminate the contract, which we call rescission, or they can choose to continue. However, this is governed by the rule of the contract principle. This means the minor mistake isn't enough. The breach must be fundamental and strike at the very heart of why the contract was made in the first place. We can see this in the case of Cho Yin Lo. Let's see how this works in practice. In the case of Cho Yin Lo v. SK Visuvaligam Pillai, we have a classic breach of payment term. The defendant was supposed to pay the contractor every 2 weeks. When they stopped paying, the contractor stopped booking. The court held that this refusal to pay as agreed was a fundamental breach. Why? Because the root of a service contract is the expectation of a payment for work done. Without payment, the promise was effectively broken in its entirety. We can see this in another case. Now let's look at the physical side of the contract in the case of Hua Chia Lin and Melim Jaya. Here the plaintiff bought a home, but the house delivered was full of massive structural cracks and sinking foundation. It was so bad that it has to be torn down and rebuilt. The developer argued that the contract still stood, but the court disagreed. They held that when a person buys a house, they bargain for a safe place to live. Delivering a crumbling structure is a fundamental breach that justifies putting an end to the contract under Section 40. Okay, now let's look at how these legal principles play out between Emerald and Ammon perspective. From where Emerald stands, a construction work didn't just slow down. It grounds to an absolute crushing halt for a 3 month period. By abandoning the project entirely, Ammon committed a direct severe violation of Term 3 of their contract, which explicitly mandates diligent progress and grants a right to terminate. But notice Emerald's conduct here. They didn't just knee-jerk terminate. They act reasonably. On January 15, 2025, they issue a formal 14 days notice to cure. Ammon chose to let those 14 days lapse without resuming any work. By doing so, Ammon solidified an absolute refusal to perform under Section 40, effectively handling Ammon that clear legal rights to end the contract. On Ammon's counter perspective, how will Ammon try to defend this? They are going to argue that this wasn't a willful refusal to perform under Section 40, but rather a temporary, painful operational pause forced upon them by external economic realities. They will point to substantially increased material prices and argue that Emerald's refusal to grant the full RM 1 million variation or advance their request effectively choke their cash flow. They will claim they never intend to permanently abandon the project. They will just waiting with the tools down for more workable financial agreement to be negotiated. Okay, now applying this principle to our conclusion. In conclusion, Ammon's action weren't a minor delay. The total cessation of the work was a fundamental repudiatory breach that struck right at the root of the contract. Furthermore, simply stating we don't have the money is legally void as an excuse for abandoning the work, especially after ignoring Emerald's 14 days notice. What I really want to emphasize here is that the timeline. Because Ammon explicitly refused to carry out their central obligation, Emerald's rights to terminate the material breach was already locked in. The supervening events that happened later in February 2025 don't retroactively save Emmons because Emerald's path to termination was fully solidified because those events even took place. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Following the events my teammate just described, we must address the supervening events that occurred in February 2025. The core legal issue here is whether Aman-built SDN-BHD may rely on the doctrine of frustration and the force majeure clause to avoid liability despite its pure repudiatory breach and the complete cessation of construction works. In other words, does a natural disaster wipe the slate clean for a contractor who had already abandoned the project? To answer this, we look at both statutory law and established case law. Under Section 57, subsection 2 of the Contract Acts 1950, a contract becomes void when the act required becomes impossible or unlawful after the contract is made, by reason of some event which the promisor could not prevent. However, there is a crucial exception, the doctrine of self-induced frustration. In the landmark case of Guan Aikmo KL SDN-BHD against Selangor Properties Berhad, the Court of Appeal laid down a strict three-limb test. The three-limb dictates that the supervening events must not be due to the fault or act of either party. If a party's own prior default, delay, or breach created the situation that exposed them to the frustrating event, the frustration is legally deemed self-induced and cannot be used as a defense. Furthermore, regarding the contract's major clause, the federal court established in Masila, Malaysia SDN-BHD against Taylor Woodrow International Limited that such clauses protected parties from unexpected events beyond their control. But importantly, a force majeure clause cannot be invoked by a party whose own unexcused delays or prior material breaches placed them in a position of non-performance before the force majeure event occurred. When we apply this law to the facts, we must consider both perspectives. First, let us look at Aman's perspective. Aman will heavily point out the catastrophic events of 5 February 2025, where severe flash floods physically ruined the structure, followed by a mandatory local authority order freezing all construction for 2 years. Aman will argue that under Term 4 of the contract, the flood is an act of God and the review ban is a government intervention that was completely beyond their control. Simultaneously, they will argue that under Section 57, subsection 2, a 2-year legal ban makes performing a 12-month contract radically impossible and unlawful. Therefore, Aman claims that the contract was discharged by frustration on 5 February, wiping away all their liability. However, Emerald has a very strong counter perspective. Emerald will argue that Aman is completely barred from using either Section 57, subsection 2 or Term 4 because the frustration was entirely self-induced. The facts explicitly shows that Aman had completely stopped work months before, between November 2024 and January 2025. And Emerald had already placed Aman in default via a 14-day notice on 15 January. Emerald will argue that Aman proceeded diligently up to January. The complex would have been closer to completion or structurally resilient. Ultimately, Aman's unlawful abandonment is the sole reason why an incomplete vulnerable structure was sitting exposed on the site on 5 February. Aman cannot use a sudden disaster to escape an existing fundamental breach. This brings us to the conclusion for this issue. Aman cannot rely on either the contract's force majeure clause or the statutory doctrine of frustration. Following the legal rule established in Guan Aikmo, because Aman was already in an unremedied state of fundamental repudiatory breach before the flood happened, the impossibility was entirely self-induced. Thus, the contract was not discharged by frustration. It remained alive and was validly terminated by Emerald on 10 February 2025 due to breach, keeping Aman fully liable for the consequences. I will now pass the presentation to my teammate to discuss the financial remedies and Emerald's right to claim damages.
Hello, madam. My name is Madhura Ravishankar, and I'm going to present the issue 5, which is whether Amerland Developments Indian Berhad is entitled to claim financial remedies against Aman Build Sandian Berhad for the reparatory breach of the construction contract, and whether Aman Bill Sandian Berhad is entitled to claim payment for the 75% of construction work completed prior to the termination of the contract. Now let me explain the laws and cases that apply. The first law is Section 74 subsection 1 of the Contract Act. This law says that if a person breaks a contract, they must repay compensation for the losses caused. Under Section 74, there is two parts. The first part cover losses that naturally and directly happen because of the breach. No special proof is needed. In our case, this applies to the cost of hiring a replacement contractor. The second part is cover losses that both parties already knew could happen when they first signed the contract. This requires proof of specific knowledge at the time of contracting. In our case, this applies to lost rental income. So the case of Tam Chio Tho against Associated Metal Smelters Limited, the court held special damages are only recoverable if the defendant specifically knew about that exact loss when the contract was signed. The second law is Section 66. This law says that when a contract ends, any party who receives a benefit must return it or pay compensation for it. This is calculated on quantum merit basis, meaning you get paid for the value of work actually done. This was confirmed in Chua Nga LA against Negeri Sembilan Rubber Company Limited. Let me apply these laws to the facts. I will go through each claim one by one. First, Emerald's claim for the replacement contracted cost. Emerald will argue that because Aman abandoned the site, Emerald had to hire a new contractor to finish the remaining 25% of the work. This was under the first limb of the Section 74 because it directly results from Aman's breach. No special proof is needed. Aman will counter by saying Emerald should reduce their losses and that the government ban made replacement work premature. However, this counter is weak because Aman had already abandoned the site before the flood and before the ban. Therefore, Emerald can fully recover these costs. Second, Emerald's claim for lost rental income. Emerald will argue that since the building was always a commercial complex, Aman must have known it was for rental purpose. Therefore, Aman should have contemplated that delay would cause rental income losses. However, Aman will counter by saying the exact rental figures were never communicated when the contract was signed in January 2024. Aman will also argue that most of the delay was caused by the government's two-year ban, which was outside Aman's control. Therefore, this claim is subject to strict proof. Emerald needs to show tenancy agreement or rental projections that were shared with Aman at the time of the contracting. So the third is Aman's claim for 75% work done. Aman will argue under Section 66 that since they built 75% of the complex, Emerald must pay for the value of that work to prevent unjust enrichment based on Chua Nga LA case. However, Emerald has already paid 9 million ringgit, which is exactly 75% of the 12 million contract price. The restitution balance is zero, therefore Aman's claim is completely fails. In conclusion, on the issue of whether Emerald is entitled to financial remedies and whether Aman is entitled to payment for work done, Emerald can fully recover the replacement contracted cost under the second limb of Section 74 because they directly and naturally result from Arman's breach. However, the claim for lost rental income is subjected to strict proof under second limb. Emerald must show that Arman specifically knew about the rental plans when the contract was signed in January 2024. Emerald also cannot hold Arman responsible for the portion of delay caused by the government ban as that was an independent event outside Arman's control. As for Arman, their section 66 restitution claim completely fails. The 9 million ringgit already paid is actually equal to the value of 75% work completed. The restitution balance is zero and no further payment is owed to Arman.
To draw everything to a close, let us look at the overall conclusion. Originally, a valid and binding commercial contract existed between MLN and Arman Bilsandian Berhad, while the subsequent informal agreement in September 2024 to extend the deadline and add Rm 500,000 constituted a valid modification under Section 64 of the Contract Act 1950. This variation was strictly conditional upon Arman maintaining reasonable progress on the project. When Arman completely abandoned the site and subsequently failed to compile within the 14 days of notice to cure, this amounted to a fundamental repudiatory breach under Section 40 of the Act, as economic hardship and escalating material costs do not excuse non-performance under Malaysian law. Consequently, Arman is the only party legally obligated and liable for damages under the contract. Arman cannot escape liability by invoking the contract's force majeure clause or the statutory doctrine of frustration under Section 57, subsection 2 following the February 2025 flash flood and subsequent government ban. Because Arman was already in an unremedied state of fundamental breach before the disaster occurred, this frustration is legally deemed self-induced. Therefore, the contract remained legally alive until MLN validity terminated it on 10th February 2025. As for financial obligation, MLN has fully discharged its liability by paying Rm 9 million for the 75% of work completed, meaning the restitution balance under Section 66 is zero and Arman is entitled to no extra money. Instead, Arman is now legally obligated to pay MLN damages under Section 74 subsection 1, which includes the cost of hiring a replacement contractor to finish the project. Finally, we have formulated some critical professional recommendations based on this dispute. As practical advice, parties in construction contracts should always execute formal supplementary agreements for all variation rather than relying on informal communication. Furthermore, it is crucial to clearly define force majeure, consequence and maintain robust risk allocation mechanism from the very beginning to minimize future disputes and protect project viability. So that's all from us. Thank you.